Okay. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay, it's good. So did you guys get a chance to do the homework? If anyone needs the links, they are in the chat for the passages. So now I'm just going to go through the questions. So this is a passage. So if you have an answer, you can put it in the chat, and then if you are okay with being called on to either explain your answer, or if you have a question, if you could put like a little asterisk after your answer, or just unmute your mic and speak, that would be great. Okay, so the first question was, which of the following would not be observed during the activation of the GPCR associated with protein kinase A? So if you guys had an answer for that, could you please put it in the chat or say out loud? If you like 30 seconds to do so. Okay, it actually is C. So let's look at the mechanism. So once the receptor binds, what happens is that the GDP is released from the G protein because it's exchanged for a GTP. And then here you have the dissociation of the heterotrimer where the alpha unit breaks off to go attach the adenylyl cyclase. So that's why B is a part of the mechanism. And then, so once adenylyl cyclase is bound, you get a release of more CAMP, which then activates PKA. So what you don't have in the process of activating this pathway is a hydrolysis of GTP, because what you're actually getting is an exchange of GDP for GTP.
So for this question, Pranava, do we just have to review G protein activation?
Yeah, and there's two types. There's the CAMP one, and then there's one that's like IP3 and DAG. This is the one that you mostly need to know. But yeah, it's kind of just memorization.
Okay, and then what you said, CAMP and which one? What else? Other one?
I think it's like IP3 and DAG.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one, if you need to know that one. Cerise, do you know if...
Sorry, can you just repeat the question quick?
Yeah, you know how there's this one, this GPCR pathway, and then there's the other one? Do you remember the other one? Is that something we need to know?
I haven't looked at it in a long time. I can check. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll put a note in the note section of this question to follow up on that.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. So which term best describes the mechanism by which chloroquine inhibits PKA? Again, if you have an answer, put in the chat. All A's. Right. Yeah, so this is like a very fundamental topic to know. So you should know that this is the graph that you're looking at. So when you have 0 nanomolar, that's your enzyme activity for the substrate when there's no inhibitor. And then as you add more and more inhibitor, your Vmax is getting lowered, and then your Km isn't changing, which is an indicator of non-competitive inhibition. So these are the 3 graphs that you need to know. So for competitive, your Km is increased, so your x-intercept changes, but your y-intercept doesn't because your Vmax is unaffected. For uncompetitive, both are reduced. And then non-competitive, Km isn't affected, but then Vmax is reduced. So a pretty important topic that you should have like down completely, but it looks like everyone's good with that. Any questions on that one? Moving on to the third one. Which of the following methods is most likely used to isolate the parasitic vacuoles from a homogenate of lysed erythrocytes? Okay, seeing all C's. Does anyone want to explain this one at all? Okay, no. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Like for me, I just thought it was centrifugation because different densities is the way that like centrifuging works. And so I figured that like by using the different densities of like the vacuoles and the erythrocytes, you'd be able like to separate the two.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly right. Thank you. So you have the cell homogenate, which is like the stuff that you get after you break apart the cell, which is what the lysing is. And then, like you said, slow sedimenting would be the ones that are, the sedimentation depends on the density. So then you can separate different cell organelles based on their sizes and densities. And here's just a picture of all the other different lab techniques they mentioned. So ELISAs are used to quantify like how much of a substrate that you have. So here it looks like you're trying to identify how much antibody you have. And then what you do is link it to another antibody that has like an enzyme on it. So based on how that enzyme catalyzes a reaction, and that enzyme reaction changes color. So based on the color change, you can quantify how much of your original antibody you have in the solution. And then immunohistochemistry is detecting what antigen you have on the surface of a cell. So if you're trying to identify this green one, you recognize with an antibody and then give it some kind of label so that you're able to recognize that in your experimentation. And then isoelectric focusing is sorting different molecules by their charge based on their, so like everything in the body is at physiological pH, but then if the molecules are at neutral at different charges, we can use their charges at physiological pHs to sort them. Any questions on any of these lab techniques? Okay. Fourth question. Which of the following is most likely a way that resistance to chloroquine develops in P. falciparum? Anyone else? Does anyone want to explain this one? So this one is not any background knowledge, it's just carefully reading the passage and understanding it. So the correct answer is D. So increased synthesis of transmembrane chloroquine pumps in parasitic vacuoles. So I have a screenshot of the passage in the next slide. But basically what happens is that the chloroquine is able to go in the vacuoles, and that's where it prevents the parasite from synthesizing like the heme compound that it needs to. So if there's transmembrane pumps that take the chloroquine out of the vacuoles, that'll prevent the chloroquine from inhibiting the parasite's reaction. So let's see. So it says chloroquine becomes trapped in the digestive vacuole, which it's protonated to CQH2 due to acidic conditions. And this acidic version prevents the hemozoin formation that the parasite needs. So if we look at B, increased acidity is actually good because it allows more formation of the CQH2, which is the form of the chloroquine that is the inhibitor. So that's why that would not be correct. One second. And then increased enzymatic digestion of hemoglobin into heme. So heme is toxic to the parasite. So if there was more heme, that wouldn't give it resistance, that would kill the parasite. And then the last one, decreased synthesis of cytosolic CAMP. So CAMP activates pKa, which is needed for the growth of the parasite. So if you have less CAMP, the parasite isn't going to have increased resistance, which is like increased ability to survive. It's going to die more easily.
Could you explain again, Pranava, why it's D? Because I guess I'm not understanding how there's going to be resistance if CQ pumps are like in the parasitic vacuoles. Yeah. I would think it would be like more so the opposite.
So the answer is D. I thought I heard you say B, but maybe I heard you wrong.
Yeah, I guess I'm not understanding the main concept, because I would assume it would be the opposite. Like they would, I guess, die.
Okay. So the chloroquine is acting as an inhibitor when it gets trapped in the digestive vacuole. And then the mechanism isn't clear, like it says somehow prevents, but the reason the vacuole is important is because it changes the chloroquine into a form that is actually able to act like an inhibitor. Like you see how it says CQH2 is the one that's preventing the hemozoin formation?
Yeah.
We don't get that CQH2 unless the CQ gets trapped in the digestive vacuole. Is that clear up until there?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. So then once you have the, to get that CQH2, then you need the vacuole, right? So if you have pumps that are getting put on the membrane of the vacuoles, what's happening is that you're pumping out the chloroquine away from the vacuoles.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions on that? Okay. Given that P. falciparum is eukaryotic, which of the following would it not be associated with? Okay, perfect. Yeah. So polyatyl, that's eukaryotic. So that because this is a post-transcriptional modification. And then this is just like a fact that you have to know sometimes, I guess, like the sedimentation units of the ribosomes of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. And then mRNA containing one gene is in eukaryotes. In prokaryotes, mRNA can code for multiple genes on the same mRNA. And then simultaneous transcription and translation can only be in prokaryotes, because in eukaryotes, transcription occurs in the nucleus, while translation occurs in the cytoplasm, whereas in prokaryotes, both occur in the cytoplasm, so they can occur simultaneously. So this is just a summary of that. Again, a pretty fundamental concept to get down. Okay. Any questions on that one? Last one, which conclusion is best supported by the data presented in the passage? Okay, C. Okay, so the activity, like pKa being most active, is based on a passage phrase that said like there's translocation from the cytosol to the membrane. So wherever there's the highest localization of pKa to the membrane, that's going to be where it's most active. So it's just looking at this one graph. Any questions on that? Any questions on that passage in general before we move on? Okay, now we have the psych-social passage.
Okay, so do you want to click and click through? Okay, so the first question is, during the follow-up study, the researchers will most likely need to be careful to minimize the effects of which of the following. And again, if you just want to drop answers in the chat. Oh. Okay, do you want to click Pranava? So the answer, which I'm seeing people choose, is extinction. Does anybody want to explain? Okay, do you want to click again, Pranava? So the important piece of the passage to recognize here is obviously like what the follow-up study is. So I've highlighted the piece of the passage and put it here. And so you can see that it says for once a week for 12 weeks, they take part in sessions. And if they demonstrate a coping strategy, they're rewarded. The frequency is then reduced. So if you want to click again, we know that they're conditioning a response, using operant conditioning because they're rewarding. And so the effect that needs to be minimized is extinction, because extinction is the loss of a conditioned response over time. So as they reduce the frequency of prize giving, there's a possibility that the conditioned response will be lost with it. So that's the right answer. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, do you want to click again? So the design of the initial study is most vulnerable to which type of bias? And if you want to put answers in. Okay, so I'm seeing some Ds. Does anybody want to explain? And you can click twice, Pranava. Yeah. So the answer is D, it's selection bias. And then I've highlighted kind of what you could use to help you figure this out. So the passage says that questionnaires were sent to specific students who attend these high schools. And if you want to click again, selection bias, we should know, arises from improper randomization of individuals selected. So you can see that they're picking very specific people to send these surveys to. And so the most, like, this piece of the process then lends itself to being most vulnerable to selection bias of these four. Okay, do you want to click again, unless there's any questions? Okay. Do you want to go back, since we have a question on what implicit bias is? So implicit bias is like the underlying bias that could be presented, if that makes sense. So like an implicit bias would be one that is not like purposefully like being brought to the table. So like there's a lot of implicit biases that people hold about like other groups, and this is actually like quite problematic, right? So that wouldn't be, yeah, like prejudices are similar. Yeah. So it's like something that like the design of the initial study that you're given, there's no reason to believe that would be like most vulnerable to implicit bias. I don't know if you have another way of explaining that, Pranava. I find it kind of hard to like, yeah, it is that it's like implicit, right? So, okay. As someone says, that makes sense. Thanks. Okay, do you want to click again to the next one? So the design of the initial study is best described as, and answers. Yeah. Okay, so most people said A, and it is cross-sectional. If you want to click again, So this study was a study of a population at like one snapshot in time. So, you know, it's taking like, if you think of everything, it's taking like one cross-sectional picture of, you know, what could go on for a longer time. So it's not longitudinal because it's not going over time. It's not experimental because they're not, you know, like picking something and manipulating a variable, and it's not retrospective because it's not retrospective. It's not looking backwards. Okay, do you want to click again? So which conclusion about children and collectivist cultures is not supported by the data presented in Table 1? And if you want to drop answers. Yeah, does anybody want to try to explain this one? Otherwise, I can explain it, of course. Do you want to click? So the answer is C. And then if you click again, the table will come up. Oh, so the key here is, and this actually got me at first when I was going through it, I did it too quickly and I missed the not. So make sure that you catch that. And then if you look at this table, you want to click again, actually. So this one, it's like a reminder to read the figure legend. Like you have to read the legend, otherwise it makes no sense. So if you read the figure legend, it says correlation for boys are indicated above the diagonal, while correlations for girls are indicated belowhand. So then in order to actually like make use of this table, the only things you really need to know are that the strongest correlation is like absolute value of 1, right? So that would be like, that allows you to figure out that in girls, warmth and pressure are more strongly related than anxiety and pressure, for example. And then the difference between positive and negative association you can get with coefficients from the table. And then like meaning the sign of the coefficient, excuse me. And then the one thing that you cannot get from this table is that boys experience relatively greater levels of depressive symptoms. And that's because the coefficients here do not represent like one level of depressive symptoms. It's just telling you the strength of the correlation between the parent's attribute and the symptom that their child displays. So, but it doesn't allow for you to compare the actual level of symptoms that a boy experiences compared to a girl based off of the table. And of course, ask if that doesn't make sense. Okay, should we do the next one? So then what would a functionalist theorist say is the manifest function of parental pressure? Yeah, so I see a couple D's, and D is the answer. And so a functionalist, if you want to click, I don't know if I, so yeah, like the manifest function would be children working harder like to succeed. So if you thought that it could be B, B would be like the latent function, like the unintended thing that happens as a result of parental pressure. But the seemingly like the goal of parental pressure would be for children to push themselves harder to succeed academically. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, otherwise, I think we move on to the next passage. Oh, no, sorry, last question. So according to the passage, students who are first generation immigrants are likely to experience and I see a couple B's. So B is the right answer. And the key here is knowing the difference between role conflict and role strain, and this can at times be a bit confusing. But what's important to note is that the students are, and you can click Pranava, the students are experiencing tension within one role of being like students, children, like being themselves. So that's a role strain. If it were tension between different roles that the students had, then it would be role conflict. So I think a classic example of Yeah. Oh, so somebody says they remember it as strain being single rule, which is a good way to remember it. So yeah, we'll start with S's. So a classic example of role conflict is, I think like a working mother, right, who experiences tension between her role as a mother and her role as a worker, for example. So if there's conflict between those two roles, then that's role conflict, or tension between them, it's role conflict. Okay, I think that actually is the last question for this one. And then we will do a live passage. So, Pranava, how long do we give for the live passage?
Let's see. It looks like a short passage, so about like 8 minutes.
Okay. Someone just asked if I make up the definitions. Oh, yeah, I tried to just digest it to the most relevant information that you actually need. So, and then, yeah, so we'll give you 8 minutes. So at 6:35, oh, sorry, 1:35, we'll come back.
Could I have 1 minute to grab my calculator? I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. So we'll say 1:36.
Okay, thank you.
The link to the passage is in the chat if it's hard for anyone to read on screen.
Okay, so hopefully everyone's had a chance to read this, but I think we can click to the next slide now. If Pranava might be away.
Sorry, I lost my tab. Just give me one second.
No, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so the first question is a 0.5 kilo rubber block slides 2 meters down a 30-degree incline made of concrete and asks how much work is done by the force of friction on the rubber block during the object's motion. And if you want to drop your answers. Okay, so far there's 1D. Anybody else? Okay, do you want to click? So the answer is D, which is minus 6.8 joules. So I see a C, so someone got the magnitude. So we have the magnitude right for both of them. And then if you click to the next slide, so I've put together the steps of the problem. So the first thing that you need to do is find the normal force. So you can use the inclined plane diagram that's given to you and trig relations to get that the force of gravity should be mg cosine theta. And because the system is in vertical equilibrium, the normal force will be equal to, and when I mean vertical equilibrium, I mean relative to the plane of like the inclined plane. Like it's not moving up or down, it's just sliding towards the ground. So we know that Fn must be equal to Fg. So Fg, like perpendicular to the inclined plane. So that means it's also mg cosine theta. So then using the normal force, we can find the force of friction. So we know that since the block is moving, we're working with kinetic friction. So then we get the coefficient of kinetic friction from the table. And we use the equation force of friction, sorry, those should have subscripts, is mu k of the times the normal force. And then we use that to calculate work. So work is force applied over a distance. So it's that force times 2 meters. And that gives you 6.8 when you plug in all of the numbers from the problem. And then because friction is acting opposite the direction of motion, the work that friction is doing is negative, which is how you end up with negative 6.8 joules. Does anybody have any questions on that? I tried to break it down.
What coefficient did you use specifically from the for the table? I know you use static friction, but could you state the number?
So you use the coefficient of kinetic friction of rubber on concrete. So you have to get that from the table. So it would be it should be 0.8, it looks like, because it tells you the materials of the two things, right? It tells you it's rubber on an inclined plane of concrete, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. And I was going to ask, I think you guys, because I don't think I was able to finish that lesson, but was it last week that you guys talked about how to draw and determine whether to use cosine or sine for inclined planes?
Yeah, so it should be on the slides from last week, but this is actually a good diagram. So if you see, there's like the thick arrow that's mg, right? And then there's the thinner arrow that's pointing perpendicular to the inclined plane.
Mm-hmm.
The angle between that mg line and the one that's perpendicular to the inclined plane is the same as theta. That's just like a trig relation. Mm-hmm. So you know that cosine theta is adjacent over hypotenuse, right? So it's that one that's pointing, it's the one of interest. Yeah, that one's right. It's adjacent over hypotenuse, which is the mg line. So then you just rearrange. So you would say like you have cosine theta is equal to the basically normal force over mg. So then you do mg cosine theta to get what we know is like equal to the normal force. Does that make sense?
I think I'm gonna have to go back and watch last week's lesson, and then I'll probably like ask the question.
Okay, yeah, it's hard. We drew, I think, some good pictures of how to break that down into components. It's hard when we don't have them up
Okay.
But yeah, that should be in the lesson. And that's why I posed this problem as well. So,
Thank you.
yeah, so someone asked if work of friction is always negative. In this case, it's negative because it's acting opposite the direction of motion. And so because friction is always acting opposite the direction of motion, it would be negative, yeah. Like the work that it is doing is negative. Okay, are there any other questions? And you can always ask them in Slack as well. So I'll go to the next one. So the kinetic energy of a block during testing comes from what? Okay, so a few people are saying B, which is the correct answer. And if you want to click to the next slide. So to answer this question, what you need to, like the main concept is the work energy theorem, which is that the net work done by forces on an object will then equal the change in that object's kinetic energy. So then when you know that, you have to consider and isolate what force is actually causing the block to move. And in this case, the force that is causing the block to move is gravity, because the force of gravity is what is causing it to slide down the inclined plane. So therefore, the kinetic energy of the block is coming from work done by gravity. And are there any questions? I think a couple people said D, which was which I think was related to potential energy. And so potential energy is related to the work energy theorem. But in this case, it's asking what is doing the work that is causing the block to move. And so the thing that is actually like acting on the block, the force that is acting on the block is gravity. So that's what's important. Yeah. Are there any questions? So D is wrong. If you want to click back to what D is. So D is saying that there's potential energy stored in the incline. So the object has potential energy, like the block has a certain amount of potential energy because it's on the incline, but the kinetic energy of the block comes from the work being done by gravity to essentially convert the potential energy into kinetic energy. So the block does have potential energy, but the kinetic energy is coming from work done by gravity. And that's because of the work energy theorem. So work is being done on the block by gravity. When you ask if is that a definition, you have to memorize what definition are you referring to, because you should know the work energy theorem. So potential energy can equal kinetic energy, but that's in order to actually result based off of the law of conservation of energy. Okay, so there are two forms of energy in this problem, but basically work needs to be done to convert from one energy to the other. So the work done by forces on an object is what causes that conversion, if that makes sense. Because before the block moves, before anything acts on it, it has all potential energy. Then the work done by gravity on the block leads to it going down and gaining kinetic energy. So the question is asking for what work, what is doing work on the block, basically. And the force that's causing the block to move is gravity. That's what's causing it to move down the incline. Does that make sense? Pranav, I don't know if you have another way.
Yeah, this one is confusing. I don't know if this matters, but it says potential energy stored in the incline, and it's not necessarily energy stored in the incline. It comes from the height above the earth, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's because gravity will work on it to bring it down, right? Because you've moved it far up. So then like that's more like distance over which gravity works. That makes sense. But yes, potential energy does get converted to kinetic.
So basically, like you said, the main idea is that work needs to be done in order to be converted to one form of energy to another. So is that like, so you need that work, and that work is done by gravity in order to convert potential energy into kinetic energy?
Yeah, because until a force acts on the block, it won't move, right? So it needs gravity to do work to make it move. So it has potential energy sitting there, but until any work is done by gravity, it doesn't have kinetic energy. It's also, like Pranava also just said, there's no potential energy being stored in the incline itself, right? So the block has potential energy, but it's not because the potential energy is stored in the incline, which is what the answer says. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So I think we can do the next one. Okay, so it says a second procedure was devised using a 2-block system connected by a string shown below at the instant in time before the system moves, which of the following is true? Okay, I see a couple A's. Do you want to click? Okay, so A is correct. And then I've underlined here, so the question refers to the instant in time just before the system starts moving. So that's really important. And if you want to click, so to solve, yeah, again, it refers to the instant in time right before movement. So this is a cue that we're working with static friction. So then the equation for static friction, if you click, is 0 is less than or equal to the force of static friction, which is less than or equal to the coefficient of static friction times the normal force. So then at the instant right before a movement, the force of static friction will be equal to the coefficient times the normal force. And then to get to the final answer, you have to relate static friction back to the weight of block 2. So because the system is not yet moving, it's in equilibrium. And then if you click again, therefore, the force that is basically trying to force the block to move is equal to the friction force. So the force that would be causing the block to move would be the weight of block 2, and that's equal to the force of friction, which is equal to mu s n.
Could you explain why it's not D?
Yeah, can you go back so I can see what D is? So that's because D says the weight of block 1 in the coefficient, right? So you have to think of what force is pulling the block off of the table. And what's pulling the block off of the table is the weight of block 2 because they're connected by that string. So yeah, so block 2 is trying to pull block 1, and the force of friction is opposing that motion.
Thank you. Oh,
yeah. But then we get the normal force, or we get the force of friction from the weight of block 1, because that's the normal force that's acting on block 1. So that's why both are involved.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay. So then the next one. So this is a tricky one, but which of the following is most likely true regarding the effects of rolling friction on an ideal wheel? Okay, so we have like a couple answers, and a few of them are different. So it is C. So first, I'm going to go through the answers and think of how we could try to eliminate a couple. So A says it is an example of kinetic friction because a rolling wheel and the surface it is in contact with are not moving relative to one another. So if they're not moving relative to one another, then that would not be kinetic friction, it would be static friction. So A A itself, like as an answer, wouldn't make sense. And then the same for D, because again, if they were moving relative to one another, then it would be kinetic friction, not static friction. And then when we look at C, so C is the correct answer, and it can be a bit confusing to think about this, but a rolling wheel and the surface it's in contact with are not moving relative to one another. And that's because as a wheel, and I'll try to find a better graphic for this. I struggled to find a graphic, and I can find one and put it in the Slack. But when a wheel rolls, only a tiny piece of that wheel touches the ground at any given moment. So someone just asked this, so why is it static friction if the wheel is rolling? So think about something like sliding as a good example of kinetic friction, because they are moving like past each other like this, versus like a wheel is going to just touch for a split second and then lift back up, but it's not going to stay and make continued contact with the surface. If it stayed and made continued contact and like slid, then that would be kinetic friction, but it's just making a tiny bit and then it keeps going. So each tiny point on the wheel is only making like a split second of contact. So that's why it's static. Okay. But you can also look at the other answers, like A and D, like you can just eliminate. And then B would also not be a definition. That's an example of kinetic friction. So you can also kind of do it through process of elimination. Okay.
Wait, why isn't it B again?
Why is it not B?
Yeah.
Because that's just like the definition of kinetic friction is not to do with the point of contact acting as a fulcrum applying torque to the wheel.
Okay. This is like rotational force, I guess.
Yeah, like kinetic friction refers to like the motion of an object opposing the motion of another, right? So like the block sliding down the inclined plane is a really example of kinetic friction, right? Because it's prolonged contact and the block is like opposing the movement. The force of friction is opposing the movement of the block.
I've also heard it being described as like, think about like tires on a car, like the reason tires exist is to like prevent slipping. So at the end of like at the end of the first paragraph, it says rolling friction is friction experienced without slipping. So that's like a pretty big hint that it's static friction, because kinetic friction by definition is like ice skating or something where you're like kind of like sliding around continuously. So I don't know if that helps, but I've also heard it being described like that.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, so then the last question is, which graph best represents the relationship between the applied force on the block and the resultant friction? Okay, and so we have 3 answers for D, and that is correct. So if you want to click. And then the next page has just a brief example. So if you recall the equations for static friction and kinetic friction, so at the top, so basically the block is sitting at rest. So at that point, there's static friction. So this is the equation for static friction first. And that will increase until movement because it starts at 0 and then will gradually increase until the point at which it equals mu s n, and then right there it will reach a peak and then it will drop. So you see like the graph has a sharp point and it drops so it drops there, and then it takes a constant value, and that constant value is mu k times n. And the reason that it drops is because the coefficient of kinetic friction is always lower than the coefficient of static friction. And that's just there. There is like a derivation for that, I'm sure, but that's just kind of one of those things that you should know is that kinetic friction, the coefficient of kinetic friction is lower than that of static friction. So then knowing all of those things, you would pick D. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
We only have 4 minutes to do this passage, so it's up to you guys if you want to stay like an extra 10. Well, it might take longer than that. So I think what I can just do is give this link to you, and then I'll record myself like explaining the answers, but also the explanations itself on the Jack Weston website are pretty good. So I don't know, unless you guys want to stay an extra 15 minutes. But here it is. Yeah, the link is right here. So okay. Okay, then we can just do it then. So here's a passage, and then if you don't want to read on this screen, you can click on the Jack Weston website and read it that way. I think I'll give you like 8 minutes, so what is that? At what, 2:05 we can come back? So maybe plan on staying until like 2:15ish. Does anyone need more time? Okay, give me like another minute. I'm gonna see. Gonna move on now for the sake of time. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty difficult passage, so it's good to practice with that. So the first question says, based on the passage, the author's ideal translation of an early opera would be best described as one in which the lyrics were no better than its music, but translated Italian to English, or whose lyrics were improved by the translator, or that used the best arias. We're seeing C's. That's correct. Oh yeah, there's no like really explaining for course, so I'm just going to show like what paragraph it came from. So this is paragraph 4 where it says, to the translator is in a different position. For the translator, the aria is like the opera in general. The music is already there, and it is his duty to make his verses as worthy of it as he can. Yeah, so it's not saying. So the other 3 answers are basically just irrelevant. Like there's no mention of Italian to English. It doesn't say that the lyrics can't be better than its music. It's saying that the music and the lyrics should be translated in a way that like elevates or like is most relevant to the context of the opera. Any questions on that one? Okay, so next one. Which of the author's assertion is most susceptible to empirical verification or refutation? Seeing D's. So this one actually doesn't come from the passage. So does anyone want to explain like how they understood the question? For example, what empirical verification or refutation means?
When I looked at it, empirical, I was just like can be proven, like it's not based on like opinion. So something that would have like a more clear right or wrong, or that you could like test or clearly see.
Yeah, exactly. So like the fact that A says it's distasteful, like that's an opinion, and B, arias being climactic is kind of like a subjective interpretation. Like one, I don't know, what's it called? Like one critic might interpret it differently than another's. And then C, that's like making a judgment saying that composers were careless. So that whereas D, you can kind of like check different old opera librettos and then see like if they have any similarities between them. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah. Okay. Question 3. The author mentions a Mozart opera most likely in order to do what? Okay, perfect. D is correct. So this is a main idea question, or like author's purpose question. So does anyone want to say like how that relates to, or how this question, how the Mozart opera relates to the main idea, or how you went about answering the question? I'll go back to B after this question.
I went back to look at what was stated about the Mozart opera in the paragraph specifically. And he talks about help noticing when the text is banal or silly. And I did the process of elimination. And I would assume, because Mozart was considered one of the greats, because they talk about it with the ears of his contemporaries, that would illustrate how even the great operas, they had poor lyrics.
Yeah. So it's saying like, in his time, like his opera was obviously like the highest standard, but then like the people that came after him, who kind of elevated this element of music that they're talking about, when you compare it to that, it kind of doesn't fulfill the standards. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and you can also just think about it in context of like, if the author is mentioning this like seemingly different idea, it's to connect it back to the main idea of like translation of the arias. Any questions on this one? I'm gonna go back to question 2. Or this one, right? So arias are the climactic moments of an opera. So this is like making a judgment on when there is the most emotional part or most suspenseful part of an opera, right? So like when we're watching an opera, you might think that something was more climactic than what I thought. So that's something that that's an opinion that's like hard to verify exactly. Does that make sense at all, Yeah. Okay. So question 4, a basic principle of translation is that a translation from one language to another should be as true to the exact wording of the original language as possible. The understanding means that the author's thesis about translating opera is it confirmed, more plausible, less plausible, or disproved? So I'm seeing you guys say C, which is correct. So the author, looking at paragraphs 3 and 6, so in this paragraph, he's saying that the aria does not contain information that necessarily needs to be translated literally. It's that the translator needs to convey the emotion or conflict in the lyrics. And then in paragraph 6, oh yeah, so it's saying that the Italian version needs to contain translations that are long runs and phrases, while the English version must provide open vowels. So it's saying how they should be different based on the language, so that if there's a principle of translation that says it must be the similar for all languages, and that makes it less plausible. And I think disproved is just too extreme. So, okay. Any questions on that? Okay, if not, question 5. Information in the passage suggests that early opera composers believed that opera lyrics were what? Necessary but not interesting, made to be worse than an opera's music, important but difficult to understand, or essential and in need of revision. Yeah, that's right, Rishina. I don't know if you're just clarifying or but that's correct. So yeah, 5A is correct. So let's look back in the passage. Let's see. No composer worried much about the libretto, the words that the singer sang. They took what they were given and did the best they could do with it. So Yeah, so one libretto was remarkably like another, all originality and interest had to come from the music. So it's just like a component that was there, but they weren't really utilizing it to like differentiate different operas or add any kind of interest to the piece. Any questions? Not last one. According to the passage, is it important to invest in translating an opera's arias because they are central to operas? They tend to confuse listeners. They have no words, or they're primarily emotional. Okay, there seems to be confusion on this one, so we'll spend some time on it. It's actually D. We looked at this paragraph before in another question. So it's saying how the translator needs to spend time capturing the essence of the aria because the quality of the translation that matters most. Hold on, item. Actually, sorry, that's the wrong one, I think. Let me go back to the passage. So an aria rarely contains information which it is essential for the audience to know, and must be translated literally. So it's saying it's not. Ah, wait, did I mess it up? Sorry, let me check on that. Sorry about that. Does anyone have the explanation pulled up saying what it says? Can you say what it says? If not, sorry, give me a second.
I wouldn't click on it, sorry.
It says A.
Yeah, it says A.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why I had the wrong one.
So the explanation that's offered is that oh
yeah, it is this paragraph. Okay, yeah, like it's high point musically, so okay. Whereas the paragraph I was pointing to, like Jack Weston says, that's why it's difficult, is because the information is not important. Yeah, I don't know, sorry, this one got me. I'll type up an explanation that says everything a bit more clearly, but I guess it's just saying like there's different purposes about providing different details about this aria thing. So the reason why it's important to invest, like it says, it's his duty to make the verses as worthy of it as can because they're the high points musically, whereas the one that I was pointing out, paragraph 3, this is okay, like here's why it's introducing that is because it's saying how arias present a special set of challenges in translation. So you have to look at like the purpose of the detail as well. Sorry about that. Did I confuse anyone? Any questions?
Yeah,
Anyone?
so the answer to this question is A?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is why Cars is difficult because like both pieces are present like in the passage, but then you have to think about like the purpose of why they're described. So them being primarily emotional, the author includes that to say like why it's difficult to translate them. Whereas them being central to operas is why the author says it's important to invest in translating them. Anyone have, sorry to confuse you, does it make sense? Anyone have any questions on the, okay, question 4? Yeah, so the author is making the argument that the translator should focus on capturing the emotion. So here it says an aria very rarely contains information. So skip this part of the sentence that must be translated literally. all that a translation of an arya must do is convey the emotion or conflict of emotions which it expresses. So does that make sense? It's saying the author's argument is that you don't need to translate this thing literally, you need to convey the emotions. So if you don't convey something literally, there's an opportunity for it to be translated differently based on language to language. And that's where we look at paragraph 6. So it's saying, so I don't know who this person is, but it's an Italian version. It's saying how the translation should contain a number of high notes, long runs, and phrases. But the English version, and this is a contrast, so it's saying how in a different language, it must contain like a different way of translation. So it's challenging the author's perspective because the author says it's the emotion that you must capture, but then this question is saying the translation purpose is to be literal from language to language. Does that help? Welcome. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, if not, feel free to leave and then you can stick around if anyone has any one-on-one questions or anything like that.
You.
Thank you for coming and for staying over time. If you have any feedback, if you can say that now as well. I'm going to stop recording.